this whole business of why poetry, it's an interesting question because when I was starting out as a young writer in the late 80s and early 90s, a question that I was always asked is, you write poetry, how nice. But when are you going to write your first novel?
Ah,
That was always the question because the assumption was always that poetry was what you did as a nervous young teenager. But later in your life, when you grew more self-assured and became more adult, you graduated to the form that really counted, which was
okay.
prose. And in the 90s, it meant fiction. And that's because the Indian novel had, of course, taken off big time internationally. I think if I were to answer it, I would say this. The earliest reason for turning to poetry was just the sheer joy of language in motion, that sense of a language as a kind of dance. It felt like poetry was the only place where language danced, at least me as a child. And later it felt like poetry was the only place where language seemed musical, again, to me as a young reader and listener of poetry. Later on, I started writing myself, and then it seemed to me like poetry was the only way to talk about any intense moment in my life, any liminal moment in my life. The only way to talk about it was to write a poem or to try to write what I thought was a poem.
Okay. Wow.
And still later, I think I realized poetry is also a kind of, can be a kind of act, a kind of political act. It can be a satyagraha against any kind of ready-made language, whether that language comes from scripture or commercial advertisement or political slogan. Poetry is a way of pushing back against any kind of cliche. It's about looking at any kind of easy formulation in language. And finally, I'd say poetry because of its rhythms, because of its sensuousness, and because of its pauses.
Ah,
Really, it's the only verbal art that consciously embraces pauses. And that makes it, to my mind, irreplaceable.
wow.
I speak here
Wonderful.
as a reader as well, not just as a practitioner.